Yelling is a resource? What? um, yes, it is. Yelling is a resource. Yelling releases that survival energy that we have stuck inside. And we create a whole lot of survival energy when we're angry or frustrated or irritated. You can feel it just building up inside of you and trying to come out. And so we do many things with that anger. We stuff it, we try to hide it, we ignore it. Sometimes we yell at the wrong time. Yelling does not help relationships. Just because you speak louder does not mean somebody's going to be able to hear you better, right? As a matter of fact, a lot of times the calmer we speak and the softer we speak, the louder people can hear us and respond to us, because yelling, feeling like someone's angry at you, will trigger that survival instinct inside of us. Feeling that anger directed towards us will trigger survival, and we will end up in fight or flight where we can't think rationally, we can't have good connection with people. So, but there are some benefits to yelling. Shocker. This says benefits of screaming. When I looked this up to unpack yelling as a resource, I did not find hardly anything about it as a resource, because yelling is looked at as a negative thing in our society. It's looked at as one of those things we want to avoid, that we never want to do, that if we do it, we're a bad person. And that's kind of how we respond when we hear the term yelling. But if laughter is a resource and crying is a resource, and these are ways that our body releases survival energy, yelling is also a resource. Because have you ever yelled? Whether you were doing it in a wrong way or a right way, which is kind of nuanced, but we would agree that the wrong way is to do it directed towards people. That's kind of an explosion that's coming out of us that's not helping anything, right? It's not creating anything positive in our relationships. But if you have ever yelled, you've felt that release of anger come out, like it gives it somewhere to go, right? Which is why we do it in the first place, even accidentally. It relieves stress. This says it's fun, because it can be fun if you're in an environment where that's called for, yelling or screaming or being loud. There's some environments where that's something that's expected. That's something that's appreciated and even celebrated. And so it can be fun. It's good exercise, especially if you're doing yelling at the same time as you're doing physical activity. If you've ever seen people do like karate or taekwondo or anything like that, they'll yell as they're doing their moves sometimes, right? It can help us build strength. It can build inner strength. And sometimes you will notice that as that anger comes out in the form of a noise, you can fill that space with more energy. So I know, like, when my son is working out, a lot of times he'll yell, and as he's yelling, he'll do something even stronger. He'll push himself a little bit harder. So yelling can actually help us when we're exercising. The first thing that we need to do is to make peace with anger. Anger and frustration and irritation and those things are looked at as negative emotions and as things that we need to avoid, and that make us, a toxic person. But that isn't necessarily the case. As a matter of fact, anger and irritation and frustration, all the things that fall into the category of anger, come along with the fact that we live in a broken world, that things just don't go the way that they should all the time. Also, anger and frustration and irritation can point to the fact that we can be selfish people. Things don't go the way that we want them to all the time, right? So, but we do need to make peace with the fact that we will get angry at times. We will feel irritations. Sometimes we have our boundaries crossed, and that creates anger. That triggers anger inside of us. And so we just need to accept the fact that as human beings, that is a emotion gift that has been given to us to show us internally when as we talked about before, when something needs to be addressed or dealt with. And so we need to make peace with that fact so that we don't, when we feel anger, we don't automatically feel shame and guilt as well, because that is just a normal emotion. Even biblically, when we talk about Christians, Christians tend to think that being angry, unless it's righteous anger, unless I'm righteously angry. And Christians, they take all that stuff down anger and direct it towards that, righteous anger, right? So something happens and they're like, well, I'm just righteously angry. And that's not necessarily the case. A lot of times it's all this built up normal human emotion of anger. But the Bible says, be angry and sin not. So it even says, like, that anger is going to be normal. Just don't act out in sinfully in ways that are sinful. And so we want to avoid yelling at people, right? Yelling at people is never a good idea. The younger they are, the worse it is. Well, I guess, the older they are too. On both sides of the spectrum are vulnerable people, which are children and old people. They tend to be more vulnerable to the anger of the people around them. So we want to avoid yelling directed at people. We want to find healthier ways of letting that feeling of anger release from our system. So some of the ways that we can do that is we can go where people are yelling. We can go to, a sport, any team sport that you go to, an arena or, a place where they're playing something, a competition, something like that. There's a lot of cheering going on. That can be a great place to just release some of that out of your body and let it flow. As a matter of fact, if you want to use yelling as a resource, it might be good when you're going through a stressful time in your life to buy tickets to something, buy tickets to a concert, buy tickets to a sporting event, buy tickets to something where you can go and just let some of that stuff out. If you want to designate a place around your home or in your home where you can go and just kind of let some of your anger out. If you have a closet that's well insulated, somewhere where you're not going to scare your family members half to death, because that's the other thing that it can do. Yelling, because we look at it as such a negative thing in our culture, in our American culture, because other cultures don't necessarily look at yelling. There's cultures that while they're grieving or whatever, they're yelling. They know it's a release. Like, they use it as a release of their emotions. Whereas here in America, we look at that in a negative light. And so it tends to scare people when they hear like loud groaning or growling or yelling or screaming or whatever, and it's not in a normal setting where that is appropriate, so to speak. If you don't have a place around you where sometimes there's no place you can go where you're not going to be heard, grab a pillow. You've seen people scream into pillows before. Scream, yell, growl, whatever. Just let that release of anger go. Throw the pillow. That's another thing that helps us with that release, is throwing things. Again, we don't want to be throwing things at people, but anything that you can do that throws, has a throwing motion, throwing something against something is another. Somehow that's just so satisfying. Hitting, I know people that do demos of old houses. They are always talking about their anger, releasing their anger out on those houses. And so anything that you can do in that regard can be helpful. But we also need to recognize when we have a problem, right? If you're continually feeling anger and feeling like you need these releases of anger, if you're continually exploding onto others and you can't help it, if you're living a lifestyle of yelling, you need to seek guidance, seek some help from either a counselor or a therapist, getting to the root of what is causing those issues in your life. You know, we hear a lot of stories in our culture because we have so much access to media and so much knowledge of what goes on everywhere in the world. But in America, especially, we hear a lot of these road rage incidents where somebody will be driving and all of a sudden they'll be caught up in a road rage, you know, thing, and it'll turn out to be into a physical assault or even sometimes into death and murder. And those all stem from people who have these frustration, anger, irritation, all this buildup inside of them that they're either constantly taking out on other people around them, or they've allowed to like build up so far that something just like, you know, triggers it, and suddenly they're, you know, in doing these things that, you know, blindly in rage. You know, when we get into the rage categories, into the wrath categories, those are the categories of anger where you know, you're in the place where you need to seek help. But if we use yelling as a release, and if we deal with our anger and don't, you know, ignore it and don't look at it in a guilting and shameful way, we can avoid, you know, we can avoid getting to those levels of anger within ourselves. Supplies. You need a voice. You need to be able to scream really loud and yell. A punching bag might be a good thing to have to take out your anger on. You can kind of yell as you're punching and people will just think you're exercising. That is one thing that I have considered over the years getting, but have been at a place where I have still, you know, guilted and shamed my anger into alignment. But it's one of the things that I'm considering in this season. Not that I'm in an angry season, but just as I'm learning about my resources, I think, well, that would be a good resource to have, to just go be able to punch something. Not pretending it's anyone, not pretending it's someone's face, none of those things. Maybe on occasion, but no, I'm just kidding. But to have that there can help you with that release. A playlist, music here is another place where music can really help us. And you may have a playlist, or you can create a playlist where there's songs that help you whenever you're feeling that anger inside. Sometimes singing at the top of our lungs can feel that same release as anger. So find something that you could really sing at the top of your lungs, and that can be helpful with processing through. And then a peaceful resolution on the other side, when we've yelled, when we've screamed, when we've groaned, when we've let that anger come out of us in an audible way. We want to have something on the other side of that helps us get back to peace. And so you want to find something calming, some kind of calming activity. Maybe you even feel like taking a nap after you get all of that out. It's a lot of energy and adrenaline and cortisol in your system when you feel like yelling. Find an activity on the other side of yelling, releasing your anger, to just bring you back to regulation, bring your nervous system back into regulation.